B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, March 6, 2020. Your humble host had a great day off skiing up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And my new ski helmet proved to be a real nice addition to my rig, although I didn't get a chance to crash test it, happily. And I woke up in a motel room yesterday and flipped on the TV to learn that Elizabeth Warren had, as expected, bowed to reality and announced that she is suspending her campaign for President of the United States. And I want to say this pains me, because despite my differences with Warren on foreign policy, despite the tactical matters where I disagreed with her in the campaign, when she modified her Medicare for All stance, when in January she launched these attacks blaming Bernie Sanders for sexist comments and his volunteers for using information incorrectly, and I'll detail that again in a moment. And in recent weeks, she distinguished herself by extinguishing the money-fueled campaign of Mike Bloomberg. I also believe that many of the policy papers that Elizabeth Warren presented are valuable, and I hope that other candidates will not just file them under Warren, but take a look at them and say, hey, these are good ideas that we could use to change some of the proposals that are on the table, or, in the case of Joe Biden, actually adopt some more progressive positions if he really wants the votes of Warren and Sanders supporters. And last night, as I was driving back, I have a satellite radio in my car so I can listen to the audio from the cable news channels. And I heard Rachel Maddow, live from the living room of the Warren home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in what critics or unsympathetic people might call a pity party of professional feminists. Maddow injected herself into the conversation. She said, I'm 45, I got an advanced degree. She said, I'm your perfect supporter. And Maddow said that her peers, both personal and professional, had been in touch to share their sadness. That once again, the glass ceiling remains intact. And I want to clearly say that there is real sexism in America. It does affect our political process. Women do have to meet a higher standard in all too many ways. And after the close race in 2016, driven by Hillary Clinton and her flaws, many people thought that a less flawed candidate like Elizabeth Warren might be able to make it to the top. And I think there are many reasonable analyses that can be made. Here's a New York Times piece, analysis under the byline of Lisa Lehrer. A two-man race, women aren't surprised. Subhead, frustration as diverse female group falls short in primaries. It is frustrating. You had Senator Gillibrand, Senator Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Tulsi Gabbard, Elizabeth Warren, all very different women with different perspectives who didn't make the distance. And Warren told reporters yesterday when she made her announcement that at the outset, her consultants had told her there may be only two lanes in the 2020 race, the Sanders lane and the Biden lane. And Warren said, I thought that wasn't right. But evidently, I was wrong. And in my San Francisco Chronicle, the political reporter Joe Garofoli picked up a quote from Brenda Caracci Carter, director of the Reflective Democracy Campaign, which analyzes race and gender in politics. She's the lead researcher of a recent study that concluded that white men have no electability advantage. Women in particular, we will continue to answer questions about electability until one is elected. Now, this whole electability issue is something I brought up on Wednesday, my last podcast, that we have shifted from having primaries where people support the candidate who they identify with, who advances the issues they care about. And instead, it's some kind of a gambling or sweepstakes competition. Who can use their vote to guess who's going to win? And the idea that a vote for a candidate who doesn't make the cut is a wasted vote? I don't agree with that. I think that we have to step back from this poll-driven, pundit-driven, cable news-driven exercise and say, look, I'm going to use my vote to advance the person I believe is the best candidate. And when we look at deep-seated sexism in America, there's evidence of it everywhere you look. But as it affected the Democratic presidential primaries, the one question I have not heard asked in many of these conversations is, why didn't women vote for the female candidates? Women comprise more than half of the electorate, more than half of the Democratic Party. But many women don't practice identity politics and just support a candidate because. And at the risk of exposing my partner, Kathy, about 2 years ago, she was the one who was very excited to go to a book talk by Elizabeth Warren. We went to Dominican University here in San Rafael, and, I shook Elizabeth Warren's hand, and we had a brief exchange of pleasantries. But the talk she gave was riveting. It was down to earth. She told the story that you've now heard 1,000 times about her mom having to go to work at Sears when Dad couldn't work anymore. But by the time the California primary came around, my partner Kathy was tired of Elizabeth Warren. She said that she, just didn't find her presentation as compelling as that original night 2 years ago. And I'm loath to expose Kathy's decisions in the voter booth. I'll only say that she didn't vote for Elizabeth Warren, and I did talk her down from the Bloomberg ledge. But she didn't vote for Bernie either. So my influence is greater on the podcast than it is at home. And as I referenced a moment ago, one of the things that began Elizabeth Warren's attack on Bernie Sanders and the claim that she was being unfairly treated because Sanders volunteers were given talking points, that Bernie appeals to a different set of voters than Elizabeth does. And today, in the post-withdrawal analysis here, written by Giovanni Rusinello in the New York Times, quote, "But Ms. Warren's pool of voters who are casting for an alternative after she dropped out of the Democratic race Thursday generally doesn't look like Mr. Sanders' base. There's reason to believe that former Vice President Biden could pick up nearly as many of Warren's former voters as Sanders does." Now remember how Elizabeth Warren flipped out and claimed this was so unfair. And I could not find any meanness, any Bernie bro extremism, or any kind of sexism in that kind of comparative campaigning. And then when Warren said that in a private conversation, Sanders told her that a woman couldn't win in 2020, which he vehemently denied, even when a CNN anchor ignored his denial and proceeded to follow up with Warren, asking her, when he said that, how did you feel? Well, whether or not he said it, it's a prediction that we can now say was accurate. And we don't know the context. We don't know what was said, how it was said. But for two people who were friendly at that point, to have a discussion and for one to say to the other, Trump's going to be hard to beat. I'm not sure a woman can do it. Well, this is borne out by the decisions of millions of voters already in the primaries to date. And I don't know why. I think that women deserve to be supported. As a longtime feminist myself, I would welcome the right woman as President of the United States. For me, it's not about gender, it's about the issues. And I opposed Hillary not because of her sex, but because of her bad corporate and militarily criminal policies. And here is a test of the feminism and the fight against sexism by women in the Democratic Party. Where are the people speaking up right now for Tulsi Gabbard? Because the DNC is clear that they're going to change the rules again, specifically to exclude the Congresswoman from Hawaii from the next debate on March 15th in Phoenix. According to the New York Times, the new DNC debate rules eliminate requirements that candidates meet specific polling thresholds to qualify. Earlier rules that stipulated the number of donors a candidate must have were done away with to enable Mike Bloomberg to enter the race and to appear on the debate stage where he died. And now, the DNC, which in a separate article I noted is packed with lobbyists, corporate lobbyists. They've just announced that they've got new rules, and Tulsi Gabbard is not invited. And Caitlin Johnstone, over at Consortium News, has appropriate anger, says that Gabbard is being erased by the media and by the leaders of the Democratic Party. And there was speculation on Super Tuesday that when Tulsi Gabbard split the votes of American Samoa with Mike Bloomberg, that was his only victory. Well, right there on television and in the Washington Post, Dave Weigel said if Tulsi Gabbard gets a delegate out of American Samoa, as it appears she has done, she will likely qualify for the next Democratic debate. And so I think the term erased, eradicated, redacted is accurate. And I don't believe that Tulsi Gabbard has a chance of winning. But she is a bona fide candidate. She has met the criteria, at least before it was changed. And in the good old days, when these debates were controlled by an independent commission that was too close to corporate America, I will admit, but they didn't change the standards every month. Quoting from Johnstone, the establishment narrative warfare against Gabbard's campaign dwarfs anything we've seen against Sanders, and the loathing and dismissal they've been able to generate has severely hamstrung her run. It turns out that a presidential candidate can get away with talking about economic justice and plutocracy when it comes to domestic policy, and some light dissent on matters of foreign policy will be tolerated. But aggressively attacking the heart of the actual bipartisan foreign policy consensus will get you shut down, smeared, and shunned like nothing else. And I want to note that Bernie Sanders has suffered from this whole issue about electability. It is not limited to the campaigns of females. And I don't think there's a cure because we are powerless to change the attitudes of the people who populate corporate media and who make the rules over at the DNC. I want to share a comment I found on Facebook from my friend Sue Wilson. She is the activist who tries to foster a better balance in the media, former television producer. She wrote, "Would I love to see a woman as president? It depends on which woman. I loved Elizabeth Warren until she showed me I can't trust her. Note that her poll numbers dropped through the floor after she pulled that doe-eyed stunt at a debate, telling the world that Bernie, privately 2 years ago, told her a woman can't be elected, which he denied. So I'm not the only one who felt betrayed. Now she is playing the poor me, and women across the country are punishing another progressive because they so desperately want a woman president. Will any woman president do?" That's a good question. "I am voting for the best person to beat Trump, regardless of gender. If I have to vote on behalf of my pussy, I am voting for my husband." Well, you can say that, Sue. I couldn't probably get away with it. Good advice from Ryan Grimm, publishing at The Intercept today. He says Elizabeth Warren should endorse Bernie Sanders, and not for Bernie, but for her own sake and her identity as a progressive. And in the early stages of his report, he talks about 2016 and her failure to endorse Sanders and his belief that it hurt her. And he says now it's unlikely that Biden would ever choose her as VP because of their long history going back to battles over the bankruptcy bill. And if she endorses him now, it could seal Sanders' fate, but not necessarily strengthen her hand in a Biden administration. And Grimm says Warren's long-term threat to Biden and the party establishment is only as strong as her ties to the progressive movement. And the same is true of an eventual endorsement of Biden. And he says, look, either Biden or Sanders is going to win this. So if she endorses Sanders now and Bernie doesn't make it, they both tilt and say, hold their noses and endorse Biden. And Grimm argues that she will be in a stronger position if she does that than if she goes straight into the arms of Joe Hansy Biden. So I mentioned my drive back from Lake Tahoe last night, and I spent an hour listening to a Fox News town hall live from Scranton, Pennsylvania, birthplace of Joe Biden, featuring our stable genius, yes, Donald Trump. And it was very interesting, I have to say. And I cringe when Trump goes into his con man sales pitch routines. But he's quite facile at lying and spinning, making everything about himself. Did you know that he stopped Chinese people from coming to the United States after he heard about the coronavirus? There's no evidence to support that, but he believes it. And his lingo is as frustrating as often now listening to Joe Biden. Oh, they're different in their rhetorical weaknesses. And when he was trying to defend his administration's bungled response to coronavirus, Trump relied on blaming Obama and then just reverting to unproven claims that everything's okay. But what really stuck out is when in 2 to 3 sentences, Trump nailed Joe Biden. He said, well, I was getting ready. I was all set to face Bernie. But then we have this crazy thing that happened on Tuesday, which Biden thought was Thursday. But he also said 150 million people were killed with guns and that he was running for the United States Senate. There's something going on there. Now, this is rich. All right. We know Trump's own mental health issues, his compulsive lying. But his voters and some people who would otherwise support Biden will be persuaded when you hear things that you've heard yourself repeated by Trump. And Biden is not nearly as quick on his feet and willing to bullshit as Trump is. And so you put those two guys on a debate stage? Oh, God. The dangled participles, the incomplete sentences. Anybody who cares at all about grammar and rhetoric will be unable to watch. And the crowd there seemed to soak up all of the lies that Trump told. For example, he correctly claimed that Mitch McConnell has rammed through the confirmation of about 220 federal judges. And then Trump said that he couldn't understand why Obama left him with 120 vacancies, suggesting that he was some kind of a slacker. No reference to the ongoing obstruction of the Republicans in the Senate, who blocked qualified nominees for lower courts and wouldn't even hear the conservative appointment of Merrick Garland in Obama's final year. And so this is the way that Trump communicates and that his supporters can decode and react to. So what I came away with is that Ukraine will be used on Biden. And you can't believe Trump when he says these things, but when asked, would he rather run against Biden or Bernie, he did say that he thought Bernie would be tougher. I think because Bernie is more committed to his positions. And just one other takeaway from this town hall. There was one earnest gentleman who stood up and he kissed Trump's ass. And then he said, hey, about these tweets. And he specifically cited Trump's tweets that Maxine Waters has a low IQ. And Trump spun it that he's not the one who started these insults, that he is just responding to these evil Democrats who are determined to bring him down, and that he won't turn the other cheek. And the crowd roared its approval to that twisted account of what's going on. If you only click on one link in the show file for my podcast today and you only read one piece, I insist it's this one. Alexandra Petrie, the Washington Post reporter who's been assigned to cover the Biden campaign. And she identifies the amnesia and denial of the largely African Americans in the South who rallied for Biden after they were instructed to do so by the media and by Democratic political leaders. Let me quote here liberally. Alexandra Petrie. This is a little awkward, but better late than never. I suddenly remember that Joe Biden is a dynamite candidate, something I had forgotten over the past few months of watching Joe Biden campaign. Joe Biden is the best hope of the party and its logical standard bearer. I am embarrassed that I forgot this for so long. I am here with Joe Biden now. Joe Biden is fine. He's the best hope. I know I said something about how he is the politics of the past. His rallies put me into a state of abject gloom. When he opens his mouth and starts to say things, you never exactly relax until he has put the microphone down. But, well, that was all malarkey. And I guess I was a lying dog-faced pony soldier, which it turns out is a good thing. Actually, he's great. Actually, I feel good. He's the comeback kid. He wants things for the country in the same amount that I want them. And I feel confident that manageably sized vision will bring people together. For a long time, I said things like he is not a good candidate, and this idea that America will just snap magically back to a time that never truly existed is not the way. And, quoting herself, I sure wish he'd stop massaging people's shoulders. But I just remembered that actually he is, and it is, and he should not. I feel so confident in Joe Biden now that he's doing so well. He has that momentum that I always knew he would have for sure. Please don't show me any footage of Joe Biden saying or doing things, or of me saying or doing things about Joe Biden, pointing out what I erroneously thought were major and obvious flaws in his candidacy. I forgot. They were not. And her final comment, we can all unite behind a candidate who definitely is charismatic, maybe. What I said before about how surely the party had something better to offer, I was wrong. It does not. Happy Tuesday. That is beautiful. Snark and satire. And Bill de Blasio's in hot water. The too-tall mayor of New York City, was on a TV show with Morning Joe and was asked why so many African Americans supported Joe Biden. De Blasio was picking his words carefully, but he said perhaps the African American voters had not been, they supported Biden because his record had not been sufficiently examined beyond his connection to Obama. Asked why Sanders lost decisively to Biden among black voters, de Blasio said these voters didn't know enough about Biden, remarks that some called offensive and condescending. It stands to reason if people have a certain amount of information, and I don't blame them for this, I understand it. Then he was interrupted, so you're saying they were low information? No. I'm saying you had a whole lot of candidates, which I think is a very different discussion. The information that I think people received about Biden was some of his historic connection, which understandably means something to people. So he tried to wiggle out of that. But I'm not afraid to raise the same question. I don't have an answer. Why did so many African Americans fall in line to support Joe Biden? And are we allowed to ask the question? Meanwhile, predictably, the Republicans, now that Joe Biden is back in the game, are intensifying their efforts to investigate Hunter Biden. And this is something that is obvious to anyone. And again, I respectfully ask the African Americans who fell in line for Biden, did you forget about Ukraine? So Senate Republicans led by Ron Johnson of Wisconsin want to subpoena a Ukrainian to come and testify. And it appears that they will keep the heat on Joe Biden by keeping Ukraine, Burisma, and Hunter in focus in the news cycle. And it's interesting because the New York Times hammered Bernie Sanders. We'll get to that in a moment. Then you go to the inside of the paper, and on the next page is the information about the Joe Biden and Hunter Biden investigations by Republicans. Then you turn the page once more, and you learn that Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, the crown prince, is selling a stake in a New York-based real estate startup that has profited from a special tax break included in the Trump tax package at the end of 2017. He's going to cash out for more than $25 million, and that's considered a yawner. And I do believe the Democrats need to find a friendly investigator somewhere or use the majority they have in the House to put more heat on the lack of ethics, lack of separation between the political interests and the business interests of the Trump family. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Today I want to mention Jerry in Southeast Portland. Maybe I mentioned him the other day. Let me turn the page here. Joe Carson, Marvin Rasmussen, Paul Karsh, and Margaret Anderson. They each chip in $5 or $10 a month. Could you do that? Have you ever asked yourself why I don't have a subscription to the Peter B. Collins Podcast? Well, why don't you just visit my website at peterbcollins.com. Click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and you can choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. And if you don't like PayPal, yo comprendo, you can address your correspondence and your check or money order to Collins Media Services, Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Ugly moment yesterday in Phoenix at a Bernie Sanders rally with 7,000 people at the Arizona Veterans Coliseum. A man on the upper deck of the arena unfurled a Nazi flag. He gave the Nazi salute. He shouted Sieg Heil and other comments, including insults, aimed at Jewish people. We don't have a name or other details on this individual, and we can't say with any certitude that he is a Trump supporter. But I can say with certitude that this kind of ugly, disgusting expression is authorized by Donald Trump in the way that he conducts himself and attacks other people. Well, the New York Times is keeping up the pressure, trying to keep Bernie out of the White House. David Brooks is elated. His column on the op-ed page, "The establishment gets one last chance." For those of us who believe in our political system, it's put up or shut up time. The establishment gets one last chance. And it shows just how out of touch they are. That this establishment of the Democratic Party deserves to squelch the aspirations of progressives in this brutal power play that played out right in front of us over the last week. And Paul Krugman is just slightly more even-handed. His headline reads, "Sanders is going for broke." And he does make some, valid observations. He hits Bernie for running a new TV ad that features Barack Obama saying great things about Bernie Sanders. And I don't object to this ad. I think Sanders should have rolled it out before Super Tuesday, because all the other candidates were using Obama footage. But now he's being singled out, because you know that Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren and Mike Bloomberg were all much closer to Barack Obama than Bernie Sanders. And so Krugman calls it disingenuous for Sanders to try to tie himself to Obama. And what he says here I take to heart. For Sandersism, as a philosophy, is all about rejecting Obamaism. That is, it's about refusing to accept incremental, half-a-loaf-is-better-than-none politics and demanding go-for-broke maximalism instead. The thing is, there's a case for the Sanders critique of Obama. But Sanders should own that and not pretend that he never made it. Well, I think that's a valid point. At the same time, I don't think it hurts Bernie to impress upon low-information voters, and yes, some of those are African Americans, that while he disagreed with Obama on policies like cutting Social Security, that he is not an enemy of the Democratic Party or Obama personally. But the low point in the New York Times coverage of Sanders starts on the front page today and jumps to a lengthy piece inside the paper. And it exposes how in the 1980s, as the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, Bernie Sanders made rigorous efforts to set up a sister city relationship with the town of Yaroslavl, Russia, when it was part of the Soviet Union. And this is part of the red-baiting, red-smearing, commie-pinko, fellow traveler bullshit that started with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes 2 Sundays ago and influenced the debate so they were all unable to talk about any other foreign policy issue except Castro and Cuba. Well, usually the Washington Post amplifies the attacks on Sanders that come from the New York Times. But Aaron Blake in the Post today is having none of it. He writes, "The New York Times has published a lengthy treatment on Bernie Sanders' 1988 efforts to set up a sister city arrangement. The Times reviewed previously unreported documents that showed Soviet officials viewed the alliance as a potential propaganda win." Next paragraph. "But there was someone else who saw significant benefit in this kind of thing, Ronald Reagan. Yes, the sister city programs were his idea, part of the glasnost and the opening with Gorbachev. Instead, the Times finds an opportunity once again to smack below the belt at Senator Sanders. And David Talbot, who you may know as the author of The Devil's Chessboard, former editor at Salon, he's a real treasure here in San Francisco. Glad to have him as a friend on Facebook. He says, by the Times' hysterical neo-Cold War standards, I, too, am an enemy of the state. I marched in the streets against Reagan's nuclear aggression in the 80s, and as a senior editor of Mother Jones magazine at the time, I led a peace delegation to Europe with legendary activist David Dellinger. During the trip at the height of the cruise missile crisis sparked by Reagan's destabilizing plans to install short-range nuclear missiles on Soviet borders, Dave and I met with many anti-nuke leaders in West and East Germany. Later, he writes, confronted with the shocking evidence of his Cold War peace activism, Sanders told the Times he had nothing to hide and was in fact proud of this grassroots diplomacy. Good for Bernie, writes Talbot. I'm proud of my own nuclear freeze activism, too. And you know what? Fuck the New York Times, which has helped push the country into more wars than Bernie Sanders has ever tried to stop. The blatant venom behind the Times and the corporate media's onslaught against Sanders during the election 2020 must be denounced by all fair Americans who still care about a credible Fourth Estate. In its relentless efforts to smear Sanders, the Times only degrades its own journalistic integrity. Another big win for Jason Leopold, the FOIA junkie, who uses the Freedom of Information Act as the best part of his journalism. I've known Jason for over 15 years, and I'm proud of the documents that he has forced the government to disgorge. And now he's got another chink in his armor, or whatever you want to say, a notch on his belt. Because U.S. District Court Reggie Walton, who is a hardline, pro-intelligence community judge, he was appointed by W. He used to be the chief judge on the FISA court, and Reggie Walton excoriated intelligence agencies from the FBI to the NSA for blatantly lying to the FISA court. And now, prompted by a lawsuit from Jason Leopold and his employer, BuzzFeed, Judge Walton has ordered the Justice Department to give him an unredacted copy of the Mueller report. And the judge says, in rebuking Bill Barr, that before the redacted report was released, Barr's public characterization of it had failed to provide a thorough representation of the findings, leading the court to question whether Attorney General Barr's intent was to create a one-sided narrative about the Mueller report, a narrative that is clearly, in some respects, substantively at odds with the redacted version of the Mueller report. The court cannot reconcile certain public representations made by Barr with the findings in the Mueller report. The inconsistencies made at a time when the public didn't have access to the redacted version of the report to assess the veracity of Barr's statements are a problem. And the judge said it would be disingenuous for the court to conclude that the redactions of the Mueller report pursuant to the FOIA are not tainted by Attorney General Barr's actions and representations. Now, as a longtime investigative reporter for online media, Jason Leopold has frequently seen his work stolen by major outlets with no attribution. And I'm pleased to say that in the New York Times report, quote, a department spokeswoman had no immediate comment. The lawsuit centers on freedom of information requests by the Electronic Privacy Information Center and by Jason Leopold, a BuzzFeed News reporter. Credit where credit is due. Meanwhile, the Trump campaign has filed a libel lawsuit against CNN for what they call false and defamatory statements about Trump seeking help from Russia in the 2020 election. Now, I think they should have talked about the 2016 election because I think that the false reporting by both the Times and the Post and most of the television outlets deserves a good old libel suit. Problem is, Trump's a public figure. It's very hard to prove the so-called actual malice required under law and legal precedent to sustain a conviction. Airlines are complaining that their seats are empty and they are losing a lot of money. Airline stocks dropped sharply on Thursday. And the airline executives were meeting with Trump. He may provide some sort of tax break to the airlines to try to keep them in business during this unprecedented and unpredictable crisis. And we shall see. That, of course, becomes corporate welfare in the minds of many of us. Here in San Francisco, we're watching with interest the plight of the Grand Princess. That is a cruise ship that is held 70 miles off the coast here. And the sister of a friend of ours is the unhappy passenger on the Grand Princess, among thousands of others. And they've airlifted these coronavirus test kits to the ship. They're promising to evaluate them very quickly. But the ship itself was the scene of a minor outbreak of coronavirus that led to the death of one man weeks later. And so it just has to be a terrible feeling to be on a cruise ship, to know that there are sick people there, and that the air you're breathing through the air conditioning system could be carrying the virus. I'm going to try to reach Rose, and if I can, I'll put out the podcast immediately if I'm able to get through to her and get some good comments. So the cases in the United States now exceed 250 worldwide, over 100,000 cases. The University of Washington in Seattle has suspended classes, including final exams. It'll all be done online. And Trump's lies about the coronavirus continue. He exudes a kind of ignorant confidence that may be reassuring to some people. But when he blames the Obama administration for the lack of testing equipment for this specific virus, that was 3 years ago, Donnie. I think you got to come up with some new excuses. Facebook has agreed to drop some Trump ads. They came from the campaign. They are designed to look like the official United States 2020 census. If you click on it, it tries to take your information to turn you into a political supporter. Nancy Pelosi cries foul, and Facebook is actually doing something because it violates a separate policy about not spewing misinformation about the 2020 census. Thanks for listening all the way to the bitter end of my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.